If you look at the history of video games, success is almost always a precursor to disaster. Atari ruled the world, then crashed it. Nintendo dominated the 80s, then lost the 90s to a CD-ROM add-on they abandoned that later became PlayStation and their biggest rival. But no fall from grace was quite as spectacular or as necessary as the PlayStation 3. To understand modern Sony, the Sony of God of War Ragnarok and The Last of Us, you have to understand the Sony of 2006. They were a company drunk on their own success. They had just come off the PlayStation 2, the best-selling console in human history. They weren't just a market leader, they were the market. That dominance made them arrogant. It made them believe they could sell us a $600 machine that didn't have any games but had the cell processor that nobody understood. The story of the PlayStation 3 is usually told as a failure, a stumbling block, but I'd argue it's the most important era in the PlayStation history. Why? Because the PlayStation 3 just didn't compete with the 360. It competed with Sony's ego, and for the first time, Sony lost. But here's the twist. That loss forced them into a corner. And when you corner a giant, they don't just fight back. They get weird. They get experimental. And eventually, they get humbled. This is a story of how arrogance almost destroyed PlayStation and how a generation of weird, broken, beautiful games saved it. To understand the crash, we have to talk about the captain of the ship, Ken Kutagari, the father of PlayStation. By 2005, Kutagari wasn't just an engineer, he was a visionary who seemingly transcended the need for reality. He didn't want to build a game console, he wanted to build a supercomputer for your living room. Enter the cell processor. On paper, the cell processor was a beast. In reality, it was a nightmare. It was notoriously difficult to develop for. Gabe Newell of Valve famously called it a waste of everybody's time. While Microsoft built the 360 around standard, developer-friendly architecture, Sony handed developers a Rubik's Cube and told them to make art. Then came E3 2006, the single most disastrous press conference in gaming history. $599 US. In 2006 money, adjusted for inflation, that's nearly $900 today. When people complained, Sony's executives didn't apologize. They doubled down. One executive famously said, "For the price, people will work more hours or get a second job." It was pure hubris. They assumed the brand name PlayStation was enough to override logic. They were wrong. The 360 was cheaper, it had Gears of War, it had Halo, and most importantly, it had friends. Online gaming was exploding, and Xbox Live was light years ahead of the bare-bones PlayStation Network. By 2007, the PlayStation 3 was sitting on shelves. Sony was bleeding money on every unit sold. The king hadn't just tripped, he had face planted. But this is where the story gets interesting. When you're winning, like Sony was in the PS2 era, you play it safe. You make sequels, you protect the brand, but when you're losing, when you're third place behind Nintendo and Microsoft, you get desperate. And desperation breeds creativity. Because third-party developers like EA and Activision were struggling to make their games run well on PlayStation 3, Sony realized they had to rely on their own internal studios to sell the system. They needed exclusives that you couldn't get anywhere else. And because they had nothing to lose, they started greenlighting everything. Think Tokyo Jungle, a game where humanity has vanished and you play as a Pomeranian fighting hyenas in a post-apocalyptic Shibuya. Does a market leader release this game? No. A market leader cancels this game, but a desperate Sony said, sure, why not? This pivoted to interactive drama. While Xbox was capturing the dude bro shooter market, Sony went art house. They funded Quantum Dream's Heavy Rain, a depressing noir thriller where you press X to say Jason. It was mocked by some, but it was different. It signaled that PlayStation was the place for mature narrative experiences. Then there was Little Big Planet, a physics-based platform narrated by Stephen Fry. It wasn't about shooting aliens, it was about play, create, share. It was soft, weird, and communal. And the crown jewel of this weird era, Demon's Souls. Sony actually hated this game. Shuhei Yoshida played an early build and called it crap. It was clunky, obscure, and brutally difficult. Sony had so little faith in it that they didn't even publish it outside of Japan themselves. They let Atlas handle it. But because the PS3 needed games, it existed and accidentally spawned an entire genre. This weird era is often overlooked, but it was critical. It forced Sony to diversify. They couldn't just rely on Gran Turismo anymore. They had to build a library of eclectic, strange, artistic games to justify that expensive black box. By 2009, the bleeding had to stop. Ken Kutagari stepped aside and Kaz Hirai took the wheel. Hirai was different. He wasn't just an engineer obsessed with specs. He was a businessman who understood branding. And his strategy was simple: humility. First, they changed the font. They dropped the Spider-Man font, which, let's be honest, was kind of a weird choice, and went for something cleaner. Then, the PS3 Slim. It wasn't a shiny, glossy monolith that looked like it wanted to kill you. It was a matte, smaller, and cheaper. But the real genius was the marketing. Enter Kevin Butler, the It Only Does Everything campaign. For the first time, Sony stopped taking itself so seriously. They used humor, they acknowledged the console was expensive, but framed it as a value proposition. They stopped talking down to gamers and started laughing with them. But the ultimate lesson in humility came in 2011. The PlayStation Network hack. 23 days of darkness, 77 million accounts compromised. It was an apocalypse. We saw the executives of a once arrogant corporation bowing in a deep apology on national television. This was the turning point. Sony realized that trust is a currency, and they were bankrupt. To earn it back, they couldn't just have good hardware. They had to be for the players. This trauma is directly responsible for the PS4 for the players mantra that would come later. As the generation wound down, something amazing happened. Developers figured out the cell processor. The weirdness of mid-generation matured into prestige. Uncharted 2 Among Thieves released and made the 360 look a generation behind. God of War 3 delivered a skill that simply was impossible on other hardware. And then, in 2013, the swan song, The Last of Us, a game that used every ounce of that difficult, frustrating architecture to tell a story about loss, struggle, and redemption. Fitting, isn't it? By the end of the generation, the PS3 had caught up. It actually surpassed the Xbox 360 in global sales. They had clawed their way back from the brink of death, not by buying their way out, but by making undeniable games. When Sony revealed the PlayStation 4, the arrogance was gone. The architecture was simple x86 PC based, an apology to developers. The price was $399, an apology to gamers. The marketing was focused purely on gaming, an apology for thy multimedia distraction. The massive success of the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 5 was built on the ashes of the PlayStation 3 launch. The PlayStation 3 taught Sony that they were not invincible. It taught them that being the smartest guy in the room doesn't matter if nobody wants to play your game. The PS3 era was messy. It was expensive. It was weird. But looking back at the library, from its experimental risks of Tokyo Jungle to the cinematic heights of The Last of Us, it might just be the most creative period Sony ever had. Sometimes you have to lose everything to remember who you are.